are these people?
You, Colin, you want to set it up?
So Joe, you actually, this is what you initially pitched to me. I think it was a couple of weeks ago when you contacted me. It was like, yo, man, um, just a quick check-in, and you were like, I really want to talk about this. I really want to have the opportunity to expose Biden for the devil that he is. And I mean, you've been on the show many times, and I'm sure you hear us anyway. We talk about the establishment, how, like there's no, as you said, we can't vote our way out of these situations due to people like Biden in particular. But I think, as I said earlier, I think it's interesting that, like we were yelling, sounding the alarm years ago, like back in 2020, because I was at the George Floyd protests. I saw a lot of our people kind of making the case for Biden because Trump was that bad. And I had a lot of things to say to a lot of those activists back then, and people got very happy, seemingly 3 years ago when Biden won the presidency, and everyone thought, okay, we got rid of Orange Bin. And now 3 years later, like we are possibly in the midst of two extra wars on top of the ones that we're
On top of the 7 we were already in, right?
Right.
Yeah, and then some.
And then some. Plus the economy is just shit, but pretty much if you're in the middle class in this country. So we did want to give you the opportunity. I mean, you will say this better than we ever could, but we wanted to give you the platform to share. And we know you brought receipts upon receipts upon receipts upon receipts.
Yeah.
As to why, and I mean, we've said this, but in your opinion, and I say this is, if you're going to have this energy now, not to vote for Biden, you better keep that same energy, if not even more so, a year from now.
Agreed.
So share why that should be the case.
Agreed. And thank you, guys. I appreciate this, because a little more than maybe 3.5 years ago, I vividly remember people saying, "Oh my God, hey, Biden's the guy." And Collin, we were like, "No, not him, no."
Right.
No. And many people in the mainstream legacy American media remember that Joe Biden is the architect of the crime bill. But it just seems like everybody just focused on the crime bill. Yep, Joe Biden wrote the crime bill. Joe Biden wrote the crime bill. Few people would mention the crack bill as a bad policy, in which it was, that Joe Biden was responsible for. And I think we want to play this video because there's a lot of legislation that Joe Biden wrote that a lot of people are unaware of, that we need to talk about. Because when we talk about the legislation that Joe Biden wrote, nearly every adverse socioeconomic and sociopolitical position that most Americans live under can almost directly be attributed to Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., the current president of the United States. There's a ton of bad legislation, and we're going to talk about all of it. And when we're done talking about all of this, I hope the audience is considerably more educated as to the monster that Joe Biden is. Because sure, it's low-hanging fruit to go ahead and say that Trump was incompetent, or Trump didn't know what he was doing. And that's all well and good. And you're entitled to your opinion. But the last time I checked, Joe Biden didn't write a bill that put 100,000, I'm sorry, Donald Trump didn't write a bill that put 100,000 cops on the street and paved the way for the private prison industry.
Yeah.
Donald Trump didn't write a bill that eventually became the Patriot Act. Donald Trump didn't write a bill that made canceling student loans next to impossible, and medical debt through bankruptcy almost impossible. Trump didn't do any of that stuff. Biden did that. He did that. So we're going to talk about the legislation tonight. And I think this video is going to be a perfect illustration of where we want to go first. And then we're going to talk about the applicable legislation and the applicable bills that Joe Biden wrote after we watch this.
1986, Congress has passed over 230 new or expanded penalties for drug and criminal offenses in this United States. 230 new penalties. And these penalties range from an automatic 5 years in jail for any person caught with a rock of crack cocaine, a piece of crack cocaine as small as a quarter. I don't have a quarter with me, but if you visualize what one looks like, yeah, I do have a quarter.
Right, like a rock.
If you have a piece of crack cocaine,
the smallest amount of money
no
Biden's
bigger
ever
than
held,
this quarter that I'm holding in my hand, 1/4 of $1. We passed a law through the leadership of Senator Thurmond and myself and others, a law that says if you're caught with that, you go to jail for 5 years. You get no probation. You get nothing other than 5 years in jail. Judge doesn't have a choice. Now, the fact of the matter is, we've gone from there all the way up to saying, under the leadership of Senator Thurmond, and I'd like to suggest that I take some small credit for it myself as well, and others, the presiding officer, that there is now a death penalty. And we passed it a couple years ago. If you are a major drug dealer involved in the trafficking of drugs and murder results in your activities, you go to death. And a number of other severe penalties. We changed the law so that if you are arrested and you are a drug dealer, under our forfeiture statutes, you can, the government can, take everything you own, everything from your car to your house, your bank account, not merely what they confiscate in terms of the dollars from the transaction that you just got caught engaging in. They can take everything. We have laws in the last several years where we don't allow judges discretion to sentence people. Flat time sentencing. You get caught, you go to jail.
I mean, that's the great stuff,
all right?
right?
Let's break that video down. Let's go ahead and break that entire video down. There's several pieces of legislation that I think we need to talk about in this video. Now, the first piece of legislation we want to talk about is the Comprehensive Asset Forfeiture Act of 1984. The Comprehensive Forfeiture Act of 1984. Now, this bill authorizes what's called civil asset forfeiture. For those that don't know what civil asset forfeiture is, civil asset forfeiture happens when the cops think that you have some what's called ill-gotten gains, and you can't prove how you got those ill-gotten gains. So the cops can confiscate your property, just like they said, just like Joe Biden said in the video. And then you now have to go ahead and prove to a district attorney how you got this property. Most often you see civil asset forfeiture take place with money. People just don't trust banks, and they'll drive around or have large quantities of money on their person. Let's say a cop pulls them over and they say, hey, let me go ahead and inspect your car. You can agree to the consent of the search of your car, and they find, let's say, $10,000 in 50s and 100s. The cop asks you, hey, how'd you get this money? You say, look, I don't keep my money in banks. The cops can take your money. That's civil asset forfeiture. That bill, that Comprehensive Forfeiture Act of 1984, became part of the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984. Now, if you remember in the video, Joe Biden mentions a person named Strom Thurmond. Strom Thurmond. We will discuss Strom Thurmond much later on in all of this. Strom Thurmond was the main sponsor of the Crime Control Act of 1984. The Comprehensive Forfeiture Act, which authorized civil asset forfeiture, because you remember he says in the video, our forfeiture statutes, that became part of the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984, which became law. Joe Biden was a co-sponsor of that bill. This bill, the Comprehensive Forfeiture Act and the Crime Control Act, also strengthened the RICO Act. Yeah, remember, we've seen the RICO Act in recent conversations. And the RICO Act this bill strengthened the racketeering part of the RICO Act, which is the R in RICO, and it included the seizure of property and proceeds from racketeering. So in that video, we've already discussed the Comprehensive Forfeiture Act. Now, if you remember in that video, we also talked about you get a minimum of 5 years in jail for a small piece of crack. Now, that that piece of legislation is called the Narcotics Penalty and Enforcement Act, otherwise called the Crack House legislation, which created a rule called the 100-to-1. Nobody talked about this when Biden was running for president back in 2020, the 100-to-1 rule, which means if you have 1 gram of crack, you would need 100 grams of cocaine to receive the same punishment in prison, which is a mandatory 5-year minimum sentence. In fact, the specific punishment is if you have 5 grams of crack or 500 grams of cocaine, you get a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence. For those that don't know the metric system, 500 grams of cocaine is 16.9 ounces, a little bit more than a pound. A little bit more than a pound. Now, if you have 50 grams of crack, which is just under 2 ounces, or 5 kilograms of cocaine, which is about 2.5 pounds, you get a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence. Joe Biden wrote this as part of the 1986 Anti-Drug Act. All of this happened. And what happened with this 1986 Anti-Drug Act? It disproportionately locked up Black and brown people, and it changed the prison system from a rehabilitative system to a punitive system.
Right. Well, not only that, Biden incentivized states to build more prisons.
Yes.
That's later on. That's part of the crime bill.
Right.
That's part of the crime bill. That's not part of this specific bill I'm talking about. That's part of the crime bill. Yeah, we're going to get to that too. We're going to get to that also. Now, if you had any felony drug convictions, you had to serve a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years with a maximum up to 40 years. Bear in mind, also in 1986, Joe Biden was a ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And in 1986, the most far-right conservative Supreme Court justice was appointed to the bench, Antonin Scalia. Antonin Scalia. By the way, the chairperson of the Senate Judiciary Committee in 1986, Strom Thurmond. Again, we were going to talk about Strom Thurmond later on. In the following year, 1987, and Joe Biden references this in the video, he says, yeah, we do 5 years, no parole, no parole. We've taken the discretionary act of judges to decide cases. He's correct. All right, came as part of the Sentencing Act of 1987, as you see on the screen there. The Sentencing Act ended parole for federal prisoners. It also strengthened the United States Sentencing Commission. And the United States Sentencing Commission makes sentencing guidelines for federal crimes. So what it did, it created a rubric and said, okay, well, hey, Collin, you had heroin possession. First time offense, the rubric says you do 7.5 years in jail. See you later. And no parole for you. It doesn't matter if you're a first time offender. It didn't matter if it was a nonviolent drug offense. None of that mattered. It all just flat time sentencing. So Joe Biden wrote that bill, the Sentencing Act of 1987, which strengthened the United States Sentencing Commission, a commission that the most recent member of the Supreme Court, Ketanji Brown Jackson, was a member of.
What?
Let me say this again. The most recent member of the Supreme Court, Ketanji Brown Jackson, was a member of the United States Sentencing Commission.
Okay.
She absolutely.
I didn't know that.
It goes a little bit deeper than that. The person Ketanji Brown Jackson replaced was Stephen Breyer. She replaced Stephen Breyer. Stephen Breyer's brother was the most recent chairperson of the United States Sentencing Commission.
Okay.
There's more to all of this. All of this. And in 1987, Joe Biden became head of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And that's a big move. And we're going to explain why in a little bit. The following year, 1988, Joe Biden wrote the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988, otherwise known as the crack bill. And if you remember in the video, Joe Biden says, yep, we brought back the death penalty. That's exactly correct, because the crack bill re-established the federal death penalty. And it also authorized a minimum 5-year jail sentence for crack possession. For those that don't understand how small 5 grams is, 5 grams is equivalent to a teaspoon.
Yeah, it's like one joint. A joint
So
sometimes like a gram, depending. Like a big joint, like 5 grams.
So if you're baking something and the recipe calls for a teaspoon of baking soda, that's how much people were going to jail for. Basically a teaspoon.
Yeah.
Right.
5 grams. 5 grams. So there's your crack bill. The following year, I'm sorry, 2 years later, 1990, Joe Biden wrote and sponsored the Crime Control Act of 1990. Now, this wasn't mentioned in the video, but it's important to talk about this because what it did, it eliminated all plea bargaining for federal drug crimes. Now, if you remember, about a year ago, there was a conversation about Joe Biden canceling student loans, and he misused the Higher Education Act and he lied to everybody. Joe Biden has never been interested in canceling student loans. He's never been interested in it. Here's why. The Crime Control Act increased the wait time for bankruptcy dischargement of privately held student loans from 5 years to 7 years. It also made conditional grants for education non-dischargeable through bankruptcy. Now, why would Joe Biden do this? Because Joe Biden was from Delaware. Delaware has a lot of banks, no state taxes, and a lot of private banks that held privately held student loans. Their headquarters were in Delaware. So Joe Biden did all of these banks a solid, especially MBNA America Bank, which eventually got bought out by Bank of America, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And so Joe Biden is essentially single-handedly responsible for a large group of Americans not being able to get their student loans canceled through bankruptcy. That happened. 1991. I hope everyone's seated for this. 1991. Remember, Joe Biden was head of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He is single-handedly responsible for the Supreme Court appointment of Clarence Thomas. Right. Now, Joe Biden was head of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and at the time he had credible evidence and corroborating evidence which favored Anita Hill's sexual assault allegations against Clarence Thomas. He chose to not look at the evidence, and he chose to not speak to any of the witnesses that could have corroborated Anita Hill's story. Instead, he completely embarrassed Anita Hill in the process. By the way, Clarence Thomas was Anita Hill's supervisor when they were both working as lawyers in, the United States Department of Agriculture, if I am not mistaken. And I think Clarence Thomas was chief legal counsel there. And Clarence Thomas was Anita Hill's boss. Weeks later, Clarence Thomas got a Supreme Court appointment. Now, Clarence Thomas's Supreme Court appointment paved the way for Brett Kavanaugh to be a Supreme Court justice. And I know some of you all in the chat are like, well, Joe, wait a minute. How could that be? We'll get to it. We will get to it. We'll get to it. 1991, Joe Biden wrote the first version of the crime bill. And Collin, you might have a screenshot of that bill available. Joe Biden wrote the first version of the crime bill. That crime bill didn't go anywhere. In the same month, Joe Biden wrote the Police Officers Bill of Rights Act. Most people don't even know about this. The Police Officers Bill of Rights Act gave greater protection to cops and accused of misconduct and prohibited state and city government officials from asking questions about an officer's finances or his or her family's finances during a police misconduct investigation. So essentially, it was asset protection for the cops. Later that year in 1991, Joe Biden wrote the second version of the crime bill with Strom Thurmond. And I know I've mentioned Strom Thurmond about 3 or 4 times in this conversation, and so did Joe Biden. Who was Strom Thurmond? Strom Thurmond was a segregationist. There's no two ways of looking at this. He was a segregationist. He was Joe Biden's mentor when Joe Biden became a senator in 1972. In 1948, Strom Thurmond ran for president under the States' Rights Party, otherwise called the Dixiecrat Party. Now, the Dixiecrat Party wanted to go back to the days of segregation. They supported white supremacy, and they vowed to keep Jim Crow laws in effect. This is the Dixiecrat Party. This is the party that Strom Thurmond was the party leader of. It gets worse. In 1948, Strom Thurmond won 4 states and earned over 1 million votes. 1948, that's not long ago. Bear in mind, he was a Democrat at the time of when he ran for president. And when he ran for president in 1948, that Dixiecrat Party was not an offshoot of the Republican Party. It was an offshoot of the Democratic Party, and it was further to the right than the Republican Party of the United States.
Mm.
Colin, I think you have a video. Did you want to show?
Yeah, it's the one you sent me on Biden on Thurman, I think.
Yeah, let's go ahead and show that, please. Let's go ahead and show that.
Strom Thurmond is in every respect the son of the South. And as it was said of Robert E. Lee, Strom is an opponent without hate, a friend without treachery, a statesman without pretense, a soldier without cruelty, and a neighbor without hypocrisy. That's been the story of my relationship with Strom. We're occasionally referred to as the odd couple. Little did anyone think, including me, that when I had an opportunity to be a ranking member with Strom, that I would grow to have such genuine and deep affection for him. Strom Thurmond is in every...
It reset. There you go.
Okay. So so again, this is your current president of the United States at a birthday dinner for a segregationist, essentially calling him a friend. This is who we are dealing with. This is who we are dealing with. By the way, the second version of the crime bill passed in the Senate. It passed in the Senate. House Republicans filibustered it. Now, I'm old enough to remember Bill Clinton's election in 1992. I'm old enough to remember this. The only discernible difference from what I remember between George Bush and Bill Clinton is that Bill Clinton was willing to do 3 strikes you're out, and he vowed to give everybody a quote-unquote 21st century crime bill. Bear in mind, George Bush, who was the incumbent president, vice president under Ronald Reagan for 8 years, and former head of the CIA, looked at 3 strikes you're out and said, yo, that's a bit too extreme for me. I'm not doing that. In other words, Bill Clinton out-Republicaned the Republicans, and that's the only reason he became president of the United States.
I mean, that goes along with the narrative of, Democrats are not...
It takes a Democratic president. That's the secret.
Right. So no, it's the idea and the more I think about this, I believe this to be true. Republicans kind of say the bills that they want to do, knowing that they're not going to pass under them, that a Democrat will do. Because it's a lot easier to call out a Republican for the shit that they're going to do, but not so much for a Democrat for doing the same shit.
Yeah.
So,
Agreed.
Ugly face to ugly policy, pretty much.
Bill Clinton, this goes right into the next point, because in
Back up from your
1993,
mic a little bit. You're clipping a touch. There you go.
this goes back to 1993 now, because in 1993, 30 years ago, the third version of the crime bill got passed in the Senate and then the House. And in 1994, Bill Clinton signed it into law. And I don't think people understand how truly disastrous the crime bill was. Quadrupled the prison population, criminalized non-payment of child support. It authorized billions and billions of dollars to build private prisons. There it is. That's the House version. That's the final version of the crime bill. The Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. It authorized millions of dollars for militarized police on local, state, and federal levels. And if cops made more arrests, more private prisons were built. And this bill locked up loads of Black and brown people for nonviolent drug offenses, and in many instances for a lot of years. This is Joe Biden. Joe Biden did all of this. Also in 1994, Joe Biden was one of the main architects of the North American Free Trade Agreement, otherwise known as NAFTA.
NAFTA.
Yep.
Yeah.
NAFTA. And NAFTA sent loads of good paying jobs overseas It destroyed what was left of labor unions and dramatically increased wealth inequality. Let's keep going. 1995, Joe Biden wrote and sponsored the Counterterrorism Act of 1995. Now, the Counterterrorism Act was designed to be an anti-immigration bill. And in the bill, it talks about the focused on the expulsion of alien terrorists. Those aren't my words. Those are words that are coming directly from the bill. Alien terrorists. So the Counterterrorism Act of 1995 was designed to be an anti-immigration bill. What this bill was supposed to do was ramp up border security, increase unconsented physical searches, and advance mass surveillance, including digital surveillance through emails, phone calls, bank transactions, internet history, etc. Anything involving technology.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Well, it's not only the precursor to the Patriot Act, it's exactly where the Patriot Act came from. Yeah. Because 6 years later, September 11th happened, and a month and a half after September 11th happened, the Patriot Act got signed into law.
Here we go. I think you got me video for that, right?
Yep, let's go ahead and watch it.
I got it somewhere. Here we go. This one. No, don't begin playing already, Twitter. Jesus. You're supposed to do what I tell you to.
You can ask the Attorney General this, because I got a call when he introduced the Patriot Act. He said, Joe, I'm introducing the act basically as you wrote it in 1994. It was defeated then not by any liberals. It was defeated then by the folks who worried that we'd have the Minutemen would get in trouble, by the Mr. Barrs of the world, who were worried about the right wing, not anything else. So just that has nothing to do with you all, but just to set the record straight. Almost the same thing that got passed, the Patriot Act, was introduced by me in 1994. And it was the right wing that defeated it. You guys tried to help get it passed, including the wiretap changes and the rest. So you can ask the Attorney General this, because.
So you have him to thank for that as well. So
you're seeing it right now. You're seeing it right now. So what the Patriot Act did, the major difference between the Patriot Act and the Counterterrorism Act of 1995. And speaking of the Counterterrorism Act of 1995. Joe Biden wrote and sponsored the Senate version of the bill. The House version of the bill was sponsored by Chuck Schumer. You can go ahead and look that up. It's out there on the internet.
Shucky the Shoom.
Chuck Schumer sponsored the House version. So what the Patriot Act did, it created a massive government restructuring and created the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security didn't exist before the Patriot Act. Now, the Department of Homeland Security ended Immigration and Naturalization Service. Collin, you and I both know about that because we both had to visit INS agents to get our United States citizenships. I know I visited an INS agent when I became a citizen of the U.S. in 1995. And I vividly remember it was in downtown Baltimore. So INS ended and a new organization was formed. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS. Now, out of USCIS came Customs and Border Protection and ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The Department of Homeland Security also created the Transportation and Security Administration. Everything I just described to you, Customs and Border Protection, ICE, those are all cops. That's all it is. Just
also
more
trained
cops.
by the IDF, those cops, just in case people forgot
in
that
many
too.
instances, yes.
Yeah.
In many instances, yes. So let's continue on. 2003, Joe Biden wrote the RAVE Act. Now that bill didn't get passed in Congress, but
it sounds like a fun act that you would go to. You'd go to the RAVE Act, right? You'd set up a couple of turntables, people that have glow sticks.
What the RAVE Act involved was it dissuaded harm reduction in American nightclubs and festivals. And what it also did is it arrested anyone involved in the promotion of nightclub events where somebody was harmed by illicit drugs. Now, the RAVE Act focused specifically on ecstasy, thus the E in RAVE Act. So several months later, Joe Biden wrote and sponsored the Illicit Drug Anti-Proliferation Act of 2003. And essentially, that bill just cast a wider net for all drugs, as opposed to just focusing on ecstasy in the RAVE Act. The text from that act, the Anti-Drug Anti-Proliferation Act of 2003, became part of the PROTECT Act and was signed into law in 2003. So 20
Okay.
years ago. Joe Biden did that. 2005, Joe Biden voted for the Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act. Now, this was a bankruptcy bill that made discharging medical bills and student loan debt impossible. Done. It was over with. Biden also supported the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which deregulated the banks, facilitated mergers and acquisitions, created dozens of hedge funds, and fueled the 2008 financial crisis. Voted to cut Social Security and help Bill Clinton cut welfare. And I can't remember the name of the bill that Bill Clinton wrote. It was the Priority it was like the Go Back to Work Act or the Priority Working Act. I can't remember exactly what it is, but that bill goes to your point, Reef. That bill was a compromise with Newt Gingrich, who I think at the time was the Speaker of the House, if I'm not mistaken. And Newt Gingrich wrote with the Heritage Foundation the Contract for America.
Oh, yeah.
And the Contract for America was essentially looking to cut welfare. Now, where have we heard the Heritage Foundation before?
Supreme
Where
Court.
have we heard the name? Say again?
Supreme Court.
Supreme Court.
We've
Almost
also,
all
where
your
else have we
Supreme
heard?
Court justices are, and like half the Republican Party.
Where else have we heard from the Heritage Foundation?
You might have to remind me.
Let me dig into this. Here we go. When Mitt Romney was governor of Massachusetts,
Yeah.
Mitt Romney
The-
contacted the
Obamacare.
Heritage Foundation,
Yeah.
Obamacare.
to create Mass Care, otherwise known as Romney Care.
Romney Care, which then
Romney
became.
Care,
Yeah.
Obamacare.
which then became Obamacare, otherwise known as the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act.
Yep.
So the same people responsible for cutting welfare in the United States, the Heritage Foundation, are the same people that gave America the Affordable Care Act. Same people. Biden also supported Israel's occupation of Palestine. He obviously supported the Affordable Care Act. And remember, he was against Medicare for all, obviously against student loan cancellation, and supported every single war, including invading Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, and Somalia.
I think you've got. That might be a little long, but he definitely supported the Iraq War for sure. So.
And by the way, Biden did all of this, and none of this was involving his tenure as vice president with Obama.
Yeah.
And we all remember all of the shenanigans Obama got involved in.
Right.
All of them. So if you think Joe Biden is going to go ahead and end anything in the Middle East anytime soon, or do anything for working class Americans anywhere, look, by the way, Bill Clinton's Welfare Reform Act took health care away from children. It dramatically reduced funding for CHIP.
I put in the chat a little 12-minute video narrated by Danny Glover about his launch of the Iraq War. These people want to go watch that after this.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. We know what we've seen from Joe Biden over the past 2.5 to 3 weeks. Some of us were a bit more informed, conscientious, responsible, whatever the word is. And we knew what Joe Biden was about. Say again?
Yeah.
Principled.
Principled. Yes. And we knew what Joe Biden was about 3.5 years ago. Some of us knew what Joe Biden was about long before that. I'm hoping everything that I just said over the past 15 or 20 minutes was informative, number one. But number two, hopefully when you go to the voting booths in about a year, you'll look at Joe Biden, remember this video, look at some of the clips that will eventually come out and saying, and I can't vote for him. I can't vote for him because 4 years ago, the mainstream legacy media in the United States gaslit us and told us that Biden was the lesser of two evils. By the way, the lesser of two evils is currently funding a genocide in the Middle East and
Yep.
actively funding Nazis in the Ukraine. And that
Yep.
is the lesser of two evils. That's what we were told. That's what we were
Right.
told. And we were, and like I said before I started this entire conversation about Joe Biden, Biden's predecessor didn't write all of these bills. Biden's predecessor didn't write bills that built a bunch of prisons. Biden's predecessor didn't write a bill that criminalized non-payment of child support. Trump didn't write a bill that reestablished the federal death penalty. Trump didn't write a bill that contravenes Fourth Amendment rights, which are illegal search and seizure. Trump didn't do any of this stuff. Biden did everything I just talked to you all about. Every single one of these things.
And that was before he was a president.
This was when he was a senator out of Delaware.
Senator.
Yep.
This is when he did all of this, when he was a senator out of Delaware. All of this. And the two people that he was mentored by, I mentioned one of them, obviously Strom Thurmond. The other person he was a close mentor to, who he was mentored by, James Eastland. James Eastland, and if you go ahead and read up about James Eastland, he was a senator out of Mississippi, if I'm not mistaken. Senator out of Mississippi. He was, I think he fought I think he was a part of the armed forces at one point. And his biography says that he was a segregationist and a plantation owner. And he was and get ready for this, he was a member of the Democratic Party. James Eastland was a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, was the head of the Senate Judiciary Committee when Joe Biden was first elected to the Senate 51 years ago.
Right.
So the mentors that Joe Biden had when he was a senator was a Democratic segregationist from Mississippi and a Republican segregationist that ran under a Dixiecrat party in 1948 for the presidency of the United States and then left the Democratic Party and became a Republican. These are Joe Biden's mentors. Kind
of like Hillary Clinton was a Goldwater girl, pretty much.
Correct. Hillary Clinton was a Barry Goldwater aide in the mid to late 60s, if I'm not mistaken. There's exactly correct, Reef. Well done. Like I said in the interview with Ben, if you think we're going to vote our way out of this, we're mistaken.
You can't vote the Rothschilds out. You can't vote, Charles Schwab out. Like, that's not happening right now. So
how does anybody go? How do you vote for this? How do you vote for this?
Well,
how do you vote for a man?
I didn't.
We did.
I didn't either.
None of our. I don't think
none of us did.
I don't think any of our audience has, but like the saps who believe that Trump was just so bad and will continue to be bad did.
And they still might. Like, we got another election. That's still possible for some of these people.
They are going to, because they are going to, because to them Trump is just that awful. So and that's why I said earlier it's easy for you to kind of call out Biden now, even though people have been calling him out for years. Are you going to keep that same energy this time next year? I highly doubt it.
Well, we talked about earlier, Trump's swampy, aides and stuff, when like Steve Bannon, who was less swamp, but whatever, this is New York Times giving Biden crap about his aides, right? That they pose ethics tests, that there's ethically issues with who he's selecting, right? Who is helping them select that? To get to our next monster that's still going around. I think you have an article for this. Where is it at? I have it somewhere. It's on Anthony Blinken, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we need to have a serious conversation about Anthony Blinken, please. We absolutely do.
We're getting there. Where's it at? It's from the American Prospect, which I have here somewhere on one of these. But anyway, Yeah, but Blinken essentially is tied to the consulting firm. Here it is. That staffed that administration, right? That New York Times might pose ethics test, right? As Blinken was a part of that. So all the other people in that cabinet, Blinken could be part of the problem. But yeah. So what is that? West exec, I think, right?
Yeah, let's go ahead and talk about Antony Blinken, because I said this on my Instagram stories, I think yesterday or today. Other than Joe Biden, Antony Blinken is the most dangerous person in Washington, D.C. The most dangerous person in Washington, D.C. Antony Blinken is the current Secretary of State. He was a former Deputy National Security Advisor and Deputy Secretary of State under Barack Obama. He was also a member of the National Security Staff under Bill Clinton. Now, Reef, you mentioned that article. He was a founder of West Exec Advisors. And now West Exec Advisors is a shady consulting firm made up of former Obama administration officials. Now, what this firm did, it advised corporations to secure government contracts and provided clients with contacts, networks, and get ready for this, strategic military consulting. Firm doesn't register as lobbyists, so they can go back and forth between the private sector and the public sector with no delays. Some rumored West Exec Advisors clients included Windward. Windward is an Israeli artificial intelligence firm. Another one of their rumored clients is Shield, an artificial intelligence and drone surveillance company. This is your current Secretary of State with all of this military industrial complex experience. Now, Blinken's father, most people don't even know this. Blinken's father was a former United States ambassador to Hungary and was a former investment banker at a bank called Warburg Pincus. One of the previous CEOs of Warburg Pincus was a gentleman by the name of Timothy Geithner. Does everybody remember Timothy Geithner?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Timothy Geithner was Obama's Secretary of the Treasury. Timothy Geithner was also the architect of the TARP program, the Troubled Assets Relief Program, essentially the bank bailouts. Geithner was also responsible for the bonuses that were paid to AIG executives.
Yep.
Now, Timothy Geithner is not the CEO of that bank anymore, but at one point he was. If anybody thinks that Antony Blinken is remotely interested in ending anything in the Middle East, that's not so.
No.
That's not so. He has his hands in multiple cookie jars and his fingers in multiple pies. If anything, he's interested in continuing what's happening in the Middle East right now. He's interested. Another person that's completely interested in making sure that everything continues on is Lloyd Austin, who is a total sellout, a complete and total sellout. He's the current secretary. Say again?
Go ahead. Who is he? Because I don't think he's talked about at all, really. So
Lloyd Austin? No, he's not. We're going to talk about him. He's the current Secretary of Defense. He's a retired four-star general and retired from the armed forces in 2016. Now, when he retired, he joined the board of a steel producer and manufacturer in the United States called Nucor. Now, if you're building drones, battleships, tanks, and other military-grade weaponry, having a steel manufacturer on your side is the right place to go. Lloyd Austin was also on the board of Tenet Healthcare. Now, Tenet Healthcare was involved in a Medicare fraud scandal that cost Tenet Healthcare $925 million in penalties in 2016. Tenet Healthcare is also a major sponsor of the Clinton Foundation. Go figure. Now, Lloyd Austin also led coalition forces in Iraq. And then when everybody was saying, Lloyd, we need to chill in Iraq, come on, this isn't working, he went and asked the government for more troops. He unsuccessfully spent billions of dollars training Syrians to defeat ISIL. Austin is also a partner of Pine Island Capital, a venture capital firm founded by Antony Blinken and another person that's rarely discussed in Washington, D.C. politics, at least publicly like this, Michelle Flournoy. Michelle Flournoy was
connected to Merrill
Go ahead.
Lynch, right? Pine Island was formed, former CIT Group Merrill Lynch CEO John Thane, right? Coca-Cola exec Clyde Tuggle, you know. So yeah, informational relationship
Flournoy,
with Wes exec. Yep.
right. And Michelle Flournoy was a member of Obama's staff. She had something to do with advising the Pentagon, or she was Obama's Pentagon's policy chief. That's who Michelle Flournoy was. And if Lloyd Austin was not appointed as Secretary of Defense, Michelle Flournoy was going to get that job.
Yeah.
She was going to get that job. Lloyd Austin also supported expanding family detention. He also supported accelerating deportation. He approved hundreds of drone strikes in the Middle East. And Lloyd Austin, this is somewhat common knowledge, is also a board member of Raytheon, a defense contractor. Given everything we know about what's happening in the Middle East right now and everything that's happening in between Russia and Ukraine, does anybody honestly think that the current Secretary of Defense is interested in any sort of diplomatic talks to end either of those wars or any wars for that?
We've talked about how they've actively blocked peace talks in this. So we did that last week. So
not happening.
Yep.
Not happening. Nope. Avril Haines is another person we need to discuss. And most people have no idea who Avril Haines is. She's the current director of national intelligence. She was the deputy national security advisor under Obama. She was the former deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And the CIA does not stand for Central Intelligence Agency. If you remember anything about the Iran-Contra controversy, the CIA is the cocaine import agency.
Yeah,
that's
Oliver North.
Conversation for Oliver North. That's a whole other.
Back when those bricks came on military planes, in the words of Killer Mike.
Correct. So Haines replaced Antony Blinken as Deputy National Security Advisor, and she was responsible for thousands of drone strikes in the Middle East. In 2015, there was a torture report where U.S. soldiers were actively torturing civilians in the Middle East.
Yep.
The report was 6,700. Correct. The report was 6,700 pages. Avril Haines redacted 6,200 of those pages. She supported targeted drone killings, not drone strikes, but drone killings. She created a plan for regime change in North Korea. She was also a consultant for Palantir Technologies, and this was a data mining firm that helped the Trump administration with immigrant detention programs.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm about to say next is not common knowledge, but it's important it's germane to the conversation. Avril Haines and the current Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, who has her own issues, they're in charge of a law called the Restrict Act. The Restrict Act decides who a foreign adversary is. Congress doesn't do that. The Secretary of Commerce and the Director of National Intelligence decides who a foreign adversary is. Essentially, who America will potentially go to war with. The Restrict Act. There it is.
Mark Warner. Restrict Act is described as a systematic framework for addressing technology-based threats to the security and safety of Americans. Grants the Secretary of Commerce the authority to review transactions by certain foreign entities who offer information and communication technologies, products, or services. Right. So we can go after anyone for anything, pretty much. Yep. I mean, this is probably directly related to Kiriakou, Assange, all that stuff, putting out their information, right? So
Espionage Act, etc. Yeah.
Yep.
All of this is connected. All of this is connected. And there's some other people that we need to mention, and I know we're coming on almost 2 hours of this.
Whatever, I got time.
So we still have a little bit more to go. There are some people in Joe Biden's cabinet, his senior advisory team. We need to talk about these people. Ron Klain, Bruce Reed, Steve Ricchetti. Steve Ricchetti is a guy we need to discuss. Steve Ricchetti was Biden's chief of staff when Biden was vice president.
Okay.
He was also Bill Clinton's deputy chief of staff.
Oh, okay.
And when in between Obama and Clinton's presidencies, when Ricchetti was not a chief of staff for one of those two people, he was a lobbyist in Washington. What we see most recently in legacy media is loads of censorship. And we've seen only a handful of networks that are putting out what we watch and see and hear. There's, I think, 6 major news organizations that produce over 90% of the content we see in the mainstream legacy media. And that came from the Telecommunications Act of 1996, with Bill Clinton signed into law. The main architect of that bill was Steve Ricchetti. Bear in mind, Steve Ricchetti replaced John Podesta as Obama's as Bill Clinton's chief of staff.
Who I think also worked with Biden when he was senator, right?
That's
if
also
I'm not
correct.
mistaken.
That's also
Luckily,
correct.
we have some inside information there with none other than INN member Tar Reid, congressional aide to Biden at that time. Who
right.
talks about they were saying things like limited nuclear war was possible. That's the stuff that was said behind closed doors here. That, we can just drop a nuke here and there, it'll be fine. So yeah, lovely whole family of warmongers.
Mike Donilon is another member of Joe Biden's brain trust. Mike Donilon has been an advisor to Joe Biden since 1981. His brother is Tom Donilon, who was Biden's chief of staff and a former national security advisor to Obama. And Tom Donilon's claim to fame is he came up with this campaign slogan, "Soul of a Nation."
Yep.
If I'm not mistaken, Tom Donilon's wife is the CEO of UNICEF.
Yep. We talked about how UNICEF is terrible before too. It's pretty much a money laundering campaign for the most part. So
I know earlier on we talked about Trump's cabinet and how Trump's cabinet was terrible. And what I think Trump's cabinet had was completely unqualified people for the job. Betsy DeVos had no idea what she was doing. Steve Mnuchin, he did a lot, especially when he was the CEO of One West Bank in Southern California, the second largest mortgage holding bank in Southern California, that was responsible for over 1,000 illegal foreclosures. And the California Attorney General at the time chose to not prosecute any of those cases. The Attorney General at the time was none other than the current Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris.
Oh, yeah, of course.
That happened. And then when Kamala Harris decided to no longer become Attorney General and become a senator, the one Republican that donated to her campaign for senator was Steve Mnuchin. Then, when Steve Mnuchin had hearings to become Secretary of the Treasury under Trump, Kamala Harris voted for Steve Mnuchin's nomination. So if you think there's any difference between the Democrats and the Republicans, regardless of the administration, nope. It's nothing. It's not happening. It's not happening. And by the way, Kamala Harris, we could be here talking about everything Kamala Harris did. Convictions increased for minor drug offenses from 52% to 67%. She declined to pursue a ballot initiative that would have banned the death penalty. Mm-hmm. When she was San Francisco district attorney, a technician stole cocaine from a crime lab, and mishandled the evidence. Kamala Harris, when she was city state's attorney in San Francisco, tried to cover up the theft and did not inform the defense attorneys. Over 1,000 drug cases had to be thrown out. For my legal eagles out there, if you purposely withhold a material fact of a court case and do not disclose that to the defense, that is a Brady violation.
Yeah.
If you would have Brady.
No, continue. I mean,
no, go ahead, Reef.
No, that's, I'm trying to think of what that's called normally when you stop justice from happening. They lock you up because you didn't say things. But my brain not work right now. If
you're in court and you get a Brady violation levied against you, the case is basically done. You would almost have to throw out the case because all of the other material facts that you have for the case is essentially a house built on a deck of cards, and the foundation is made of quicksand. Everything just falls apart at that point.
Obstruction. Someone helped me out in the chat.
Kamala Harris also supported truancy laws that locked up parents that didn't send their kids to school. And without looking into the circumstances, there might have been no daycare. There might have not. The parents might have been working 2 or 3 jobs to support the family. And in San Francisco is expensive. You might have to do that.
Yeah.
Might have to do that. Kamala Harris went ahead and laughed about this. We already talked about Kamala Harris not prosecuting Steve Mnuchin. And by the way, Steve Mnuchin was a major beneficiary of the TARP program that we talked about earlier on with Timothy Geithner, because Steve Mnuchin not only profited from the foreclosure of all of those homes, the illegal foreclosure of all of those homes that Kamala Harris chose to not prosecute, but Steve Mnuchin's bank, One West Bank, also profited from the sale of those quote unquote depressed assets. So all of those homes that eventually went underwater and they illegally foreclosed on, they not only got the money from the sale of those houses, but they also got bank bailout money through the TARP program.
Yep.
Yep. And that was your former Secretary of the Treasury. But Kamala Harris's biggest crime, and I get visibly upset when I talk about this. Kamala Harris trained prisoners to fight fires, trained them. And these prisoners were training right alongside officially trained California firefighters. California firefighters earn a decent salary. They're probably making $95,000, maybe $100,000 a year to fight fires. The prisoners that were fighting fires in the forest, Kamala Harris was paying them $1.45 per day. $1.45 per day. Then when these prisoners got out of jail after serving sentences that were longer than that we were supposed to be, these prisoners that had all this fire department training couldn't get jobs because they had criminal records on they had felony convictions on their criminal records, and they couldn't get jobs. There's a special place in hell for Kamala Harris. And I mean that sincerely. There's a special place in hell for Kamala Harris.
Yep. No, I mean, these people are all like, she couldn't even get any percentage of the vote, yet she magically becomes VP. Like, okay. So yeah, we told people this then, so there is no such thing as a lesser evil. Turns out that's still evil. But yeah, we'll get to a few other evils you have lined up for the rest of the night, because we definitely want to get to this Palestine stuff. I'm sure we'll have a ton of stuff to say on that too. But yeah, no, dude, you bring loads of receipts, so I'm down.
Right. Appreciate this, and we'll probably have to clip this up a lot more. Anyone who wants to make a very short clip, basically, because I think we need a reminder of this heading now into next fall.
Yeah.
In terms of just a reminder for people, just how, not just how awful Biden has been since he's been president, but given his history, that we barely heard from mainstream media at all that, you know, and I'm going to be very fair to the majority of the population here. When we're given two shitty choices and we're not talking about how direct action or any of the things that are outside the duopoly is what we need to do in order to swerve the system that we're currently in. I get why people feel like they don't necessarily have a choice. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. But moving forward, you know, people are making the argument that, oh, Biden, like, no, Trump was going to put us in World War III. Well, right now, like, Biden is pretty much there, I would argue, at this point. That he's, and, you know, and people now, and I think this will go into the next segment, you know, the idea of genocide, to me, it doesn't get much worse than that. So, given all of this information, plus what we're seeing from Biden
now, yeah.
What's going to be your, and I'm sure, and I'd be interested to see what excuses people will make in the next few months as to, yeah, well, Biden may have done some shit, but
Trump,
you know,
that's all they got. That's all that's left.
Right.
You know.
But yeah, let's go into